He arrived under a steady rain that turned Tokyo's neon into long, liquid strokes. Miguel Santos stepped out of the airport with one backpack and a ticket folded inside his passport, an invitation to a competition at Takahashi Technologies. The invitation had been stamped, signed, and circled by a coordinator who had said, "You're exceptional." The word felt surreal to Miguel, who had grown up learning how to coax electricity and life from things other people threw away. His mother had folded a handkerchief into his pocket the way she had done when he left for college years ago, and his father had pressed a small metal wrench into his palm, a battered thing with teeth polished smooth by use. "Anak," his father had said, voice rough from years in the shipyards, "take this. If you need to open a machine, open it. If you need to open a door, open it." Miguel thought about those words now as he moved through the city. They felt like a kind of prayer, practical and stubborn. He kept his head down when people glanced at him. He had learned to carry dignity without making a fuss. He had learned, too, how to be practical. In the barangay where he grew up, building something out of nothing was more than cleverness. It was survival. Radios that stopped working were opened on the floor of a small room and made to work again because someone needed to know tonight's weather for the tricycle routes. Broken toys became tools. When Miguel fixed things as a boy, he fixed small family economies. A neighbor's fan, a sari-sari store's outdated cash box, a kitchen radio whose crackle must be quieted for an infant to sleep. Those repairs taught habits, patience, improv, and an eye for how parts might belong to each other even when they looked unrelated. Takahashi Technologies occupied the sort of building that wanted to make its engineering look clean. Glass, angles, and a logo that suggested precision. The company's head, Kenji Takahashi, had made a career on precision, the way a sculptor makes a career on exact chisels. He believed in pedigree, precise schools, measured labs, and teams that rehearsed like military units. His instincts favored predictability. To him, engineering excellence came from carefully assembled credentials and structured processes. The idea that it could be born from necessity, from a thrift shop spirit of contraption and graft, was foreign to everything he had built. When he saw Miguel's name on the participant list, Miguel Santos, Philippines, he felt something like annoyance more than curiosity. The list overflowed with people from universities he recognized, from competitions his company sponsored. A Filipino name at the bottom suggested a wild card. His first thought was practical. "We will see if he can keep up," he told the woman next to him. The conversation felt final to him, not cruel. Conclusions were the instruments a leader used to make decisions. What he did not yet know was that he had stopped listening to the world in ways that made him blind to certain kinds of intelligence. Miguel checked into a small guest house arranged by the organizers. The bed was thin, the heat worked. He set the wrench on the bedside table and lay for a while looking at the ceiling, thinking of his mother's hands, calloused at the knuckles from sewing, always moving. He thought of his father's faded tattoo and the way the man smiled when a machine hummed again. He promised them both quietly that he would not be the kind of man who gives up. That promise was simple and it was iron. The first challenge was straightforward and punishing. Assemble an autonomous unit from a provided kit in 2 hours. The kit was the same for everyone. 20 parts, a handful of fasteners, a controller board. The difference, everyone assumed, would be in experience and equipment. Teams of 3 or 4 lined up with toolboxes, laptops, and rehearsed movements. Miguel set his single backpack down and opened it. He had a screwdriver, a roll of tape, a small pair of pliers. He had his own sensibility to look at a problem and reduce it to a small number of reliable actions. When the clock began, the room turned into a practiced chaos. The teams that expected to win moved like metal dancers. A German trio snapped parts together with a choreography that looked like muscle memory. A South Korean team traded quick, quiet instructions. An American group debated a redesign politely and then executed a version of it. Miguel worked without theatrics. He read the slot in the chassis and found a way to clamp a slightly small motor with a shim of aluminum cut from a discarded tray in the parts bin. When a sensor decaligned, he rewired a signal pathway using a spare header pin and a tiny bit of solder. Where others replaced, he remade. Where others sought perfection, he sought the function that would survive the immediate problem. At 20 minutes left, a leading team experienced a failure. Their precise, expensive sensor misread a reflective surface and triggered an erratic response. Panic spread as their graceful plans unraveled into improvisation. Miguel's solution was not graceful. He had retasked a backup sensor from the kit and used a simple algorithm that preferred consistent reading over perfect precision. His robot moved imperfect but moved reliably. When the judges tested it, the little platform completed a lap. Some of the room shrugged. Some of them, including a few who had originally scoffed, smiled. Kenji, who had been watching from the observation gallery, noticed. He kept watching because he wanted to catalogue success into his framework. A single result could be explained away, he thought. He did not expect patterns. After the event, Kenji called Miguel up to his office. The man's room was all neat edges and efficient use of space. Kenji sat behind a desk that looked as if someone had built the room to complement his posture. Miguel stood, hands folded out of habit. "Tell me how you did that," Kenji said bluntly. His manner was clinical, demanding explanation the same way a faulty circuit demands troubleshooting. "Who helped you? Where did you learn this?" Miguel answered simply, "My father fixes engines. I grew up opening things to see how motion happens. I practiced after classes. No one coached me here." He said it without defensiveness, with a clarity that made his words land with clean weight. He did not embellish, Kenji frowned. "It's unusual to see self-taught work outperform institutional teams," he said. There was no accusation in the words. They were a diagnostic note. "It's unusual only when you look for skill in the wrong places," Miguel replied. He did not say more than that. He had a spare humility that kept him centered. The exchange left Kenji slightly disquieted. He could argue with the outcome. He rarely argued with data. His mind filed Miguel as an anomaly and then, against his own instinct, filed him away for observation. Kenji designed the next test almost like a thought experiment meant to prove himself right. He announced a 24-hour challenge. Construct a robot that could navigate a maze whose walls shifted unpredictably. The catch was that competitors had to use only recycled materials provided by the organizers. No new electronics, no custom parts. It was the kind of constraint that made specialists uncomfortable because their training had rewarded access to the ideal part. "This will separate theoretical skills from practical resourcefulness," Kenji said publicly. Privately, he added an aside to a colleague, half amused, half assured, "It will show us who is truly prepared." Other teams grumbled. A German team scowled at the idea of using trash. The South Korean researchers debated the ways they could adapt their sensors. The Americans already had a battery bank of custom parts they insisted could be reclassified as recycled, if one chalked a line here and there. Miguel accepted the rules as a familiar friend. In his neighborhood, the term for recycled was not scorn, it was a pallet. He had helped himself to that pallet since he was a child. A motor saved from a discarded rice cooker, a microcontroller looted from a malfunctioning toy, a wheel adapted from a broken vacuum cleaner. Where other competitors saw liability, Miguel saw possibility. For 24 hours, the facility hummed with effort and tension. Teams set up in long rows. Miguel sat with a small square of workspace and a pile of parts, beaten circuit boards with missing components, a camera module with a cracked lens, a motor that whispered when you coaxed it. He took apart things carefully, like a man opening letters he did not yet know. He rewired, scavenged, and repurposed. At one point, a young engineer from another team laughed softly when he saw Miguel's pile. "You can't do much with that," he said. Miguel smiled a small, careful smile and nodded. He did not want to explain. He did not feel the need. When the night deepened, most of the facility slept. A few lamps burned in corners. Miguel worked until his fingers cramped and his eyes stung. He whispered to himself the small comforts that workers whisper when they are trying to keep a machine together. Quick checks, little mantras, the names of the people whose faces he wanted to make proud. He thought about his mother, waking before dawn, pushing the needle through fabric in a small, hot room. He thought about his father, standing in the shipyard, hands inked with grease. Those images were stubborn supports. They kept his hands moving. He built his robot to be resilient, not elegant. He combined the cracked camera module with a patched-up range sensor and wrote code that treated visual noise as signal. He taught the controller to interpret distortions in the image as navigational cues. When a lens distorted a light pattern, it became a threshold to avoid. When reflections changed, it meant the wall had moved. He used a rubber wheel fashioned from an old scooter tire because it could handle slipperiness. When a motor failed, he had a plan B that used two smaller motors working together. His thinking was not purely mechanical, it was strategic. Always redundancies where failure mattered, simple sensors where complexity would be fragile. At dawn, judges wheeled the shifting maze into place. The structure was intentionally capricious. Pathways that opened and closed on hydraulic pistons, surfaces that tilted, and corridors that narrowed unpredictably. The rules forbade remote control that circumvented the maze logic. The robot had to sense and choose. When the clock started, teams released their devices and watched. The marbled procession broke into scattered incidents. One of the front-running robots misread a reflective flaw and spun in place. Another, relying on a high-precision sensor for a consistent pattern, tripped when the wall's surface changed composition. The maze swallowed several of the expensive entries in a way that made the audience murmur. Miguel's robot, built out of parts that some would have called junk, edged out, bumped into a shifting wall, compensated, and then found a narrow seep in the labyrinth. It stalled, corrected, and then advanced. It hit a dead end, then reversed, backed up, and then found a new path. The program he had written adapted to the maze's caprices, because he had built it with those caprices in mind. When his robot crossed the finish threshold, the room exploded in noise. People shouted and reached for phones. The company's internal feeds lit up. For a man who had believed that talent was predictable and traceable, the sight would have been discomforting. Genji felt an odd slippage of certainty. He did not want to dismiss what had happened by calling it a fluke. The problem for him was that he could not fit this evidence into the neat categories that had often made him right. That was the moment his posture toward Miguel shifted from curiosity to something that approximated respect. He called Miguel into his office again. This time, Kenji's voice did not have the barbs of a man seeking to score a point. It was the voice of someone who was recalibrating. "How did you think of using the cracked camera like that?" he asked, less a demand than an invitation. Miguel explained the logic, and in the telling there was something uncluttered and generous. He did not make claims that needed crowns. He described instead a string of small, precise decisions, how a certain distortion suggested a wall's material, how a faulty motor could be repurposed if speed was sacrificed for torque, how redundancy mattered more than speed in a shifting environment. Genji listened, and then, in a way that surprised both of them, he offered a concession. "My assumptions were wrong," he said. It was not a public confession, but it was a change in tone. For a man who had built his leadership on being right, the admission was a fracture that let light in. He explained that he would like to offer Miguel an opportunity, a scholarship to study at Takahashi's advanced program, mentorship under his own oversight, and a place on a team to develop practical robotics for communities that lacked resources. Miguel's mouth opened in a small, amazed way. He had come to Japan to compete and to learn, and maybe to make a name. He had not expected an offer that might change the course of his life. Miguel accepted with the same steadiness he used when fixing machines. He was grateful and careful. He weighed the future not in abstract ambition, but in uses. A degree would mean he could move ideas from the workshop to places where they might help more than just his family. He thought of the barangay children who scavenged parts and made toys. He thought of the woman in the market who sold him a plate of rice with a smile that folded into the next day. He accepted because he wanted to be able to teach them better, to give the tools that might multiply their cleverness. When news of the victory and the offer moved through the internet, the reaction was more complex than a single headline could capture. In the company, people debated how a contest could have such unanticipated results. In the Philippines, families crowded around small screens, tears on cheeks, joy quick and open. An aunt messaged Miguel, "We knew." His mother wrote a note and pressed it into his pocket. "Do good, remember us." His father sent a voice recording that played in the hallway. "Anak, no matter how much the world changes, keep your hands like you keep your heart, open to fixing." The messages were small and large at once. Outside of the applause were critics. Some called Kenji's gesture a PR move. Some argued that a single competition could not shift structural biases in industries that had long prioritized certain schools and backgrounds. Those criticisms were not entirely wrong. Praising one person did not unmake a system overnight. Miguel knew this. He also believed that paths opened by a single opportunity could lead to other doors. In his case, the scholarship provided a lever, a chance to prove not only that he could compete, but that he could build projects aimed at real social problems. He took the scholarship with the pragmatic optimism of someone who had learned to measure progress in repairs. The work that followed was not neat. Kenji and Miguel discovered that their differences were both intellectual and cultural. Kenji's instinct was toward precision and to push metrics and excellence as narrowly as possible. Miguel's instinct was toward usefulness and the idea that dropping an imperfect device into a village could still produce meaningful help. They debated. Kenji would push for a design that met a lab's standards. Miguel would counter that if a prototype cost 70% less and reached 10 times the people, the trade-off was not only acceptable but preferable. "You think in social terms," Kenji said once, a statement that was equal parts rebuke and compliment. Miguel answered, "I think in people's terms, machines are for people. If a machine is perfect but unreachable, it is a failure." They built a team that balanced these instincts. Miguel brought in young engineers from the Philippines, students who had shown promise not because they had pedigrees, but because they had solved small problems under impossible constraints. Kenji brought in mentors and resources. They chose projects with a simple thesis: usefulness over perfection when usefulness spread benefit. They built assistive devices for fishermen that could help carry nets or shallow water drones that mapped reefs to prevent accidents. They designed school kits that allowed teachers in distant islands to demonstrate concepts without internet access. Some projects stumbled in tests, failing sensors or corroding faster than expected. Other projects saved time and made old practices slightly easier. The work was messy and human. Back home, Miguel returned several times to visit the places that had shaped him. He ran workshops in community centers and barangay halls. He taught soldering to 20 kids at once, and then to groups of mothers who wanted to repair a fan rather than buy a new one. He told his story without embellishment. He talked about failure and about an afternoon when he had to pull a burnt motor from a device and make something useful out of it. He encouraged young people to see scrap as raw material for hope, not as an emblem of lack. The children understood quickly. They had always known in their bones that trash could be treasure. Kenji visited too. He walked through neighborhoods where small workshops tinkered away, where ingenuity was quieter and dirtier than the lab, but no less brilliant. He listened to mothers and school teachers. He watched a young woman explain the logic of a simple water pumping device she had built from a bicycle pump. He sat cross-legged on the floor of a small room and ate rice with hands that showed different kinds of labor. Those visits wore down the last of Kenji's tidy prejudices in a way that could not always be catalogued in a boardroom memo. He had believed in processes. He learned to value different metrics. He began to instruct recruitment to look beyond papers and into workshops, to offer internships to students who had pronounced curiosity and the habit of making, rather than to focus only on high GPAs. Not everyone applauded the change. Some senior engineers complained about lowered standards. Some columnists argued that the program was a publicity stunt. Miguel read such articles and felt a familiar ache, the ache of being misunderstood, but it did not settle him. The real measure of change, he thought, was not in the words of the critics, but in the lives that the projects touched. When a coastal village started using a low-cost mapping device that prevented fishing boats from hitting a new submerged reef, when a small school installed a kit that let students experiment with circuits instead of memorizing formulas, he felt satisfaction that was quiet and real. Time elongated into small victories. A graduate from the first cohort, a young woman named Liza, received an internship and then started a social enterprise that refurbished discarded electronics for small clinics. A municipality partnered with the team to deploy simple sensors for flood alerts. The company that had once hosted a competition adjusted its hiring practices to include a section on practical creativity. Candidates could present a project made from limited resources and explain their decisions. Not all of these changes were large, but the sum of them had weight. Miguel, meanwhile, kept a small corkboard in his room. Photographs of prototypes, a letter from his father, a child's drawing of a robot. He'd learned advanced theory and complex control systems at Takahashi, and he kept his old habits. He still liked to take apart a device to understand the rhythm of its parts. He still preferred practical compromises over elegant solutions that could not be reproduced in poor contexts. When he wrote code, it was often for devices that had to survive rust, damp, and children's hands. He was increasingly careful about user interfaces, preferring buttons and robust visual cues over blinking LEDs that would confuse someone unfamiliar with them. Kenji grew in unexpected ways too. He stopped measuring value only in patents or academic references. He began to see an engineer who could build something inexpensive and useful as revolutionary in a different register. He learned to wrestle with frustration at projects that failed, but then to learn from those failures and direct the company's resources toward longer-term support for grassroots innovation. He took to saying quietly in meetings, "How does this work where we have less?" He made the question an institutional habit. Even with progress, the path had complications. When the team proposed a microgrant program to fund community tinkering labs in remote islands, some executives worried about liability and the optics of supporting projects that might fail publicly. There were bureaucratic tangles with shipping equipment to distant places. There were cultural frictions, the careful, formalized processes of an established company bumping against the fluid rhythms of community-based work. Miguel learned, sometimes painfully, how to translate needs across cultural registers. He acted as an interpreter of contexts as much as of technology. He explained to the company that an approach that seemed inefficient from a laboratory standpoint produced resilience in a village. He explained to community groups that certain standards were necessary if their devices were to be scaled. It required a steady patience and regular explanations. Years later, an event crystallized what had changed. A conference convened in Manila that brought researchers, villagers who had built devices, company representatives, and a handful of government officials. Kenji sat near the end of a long table and listened as people spoke. When a small fisher explained how a simple mapping device reduced the time lost to entanglement in unseen reefs, Kenji did not lecture. He reached for a microphone and said, unadorned, "Thank you." Those two words were short and honest and carried a meaning that no white paper could contain. Miguel stood to speak too. He did not use big words. He told the story of a warped motor and a cracked camera and a neighborhood that had taught him more than any textbook could. He mentioned his mother and father. He spoke of making devices for people who needed them now, not later. There were people in the audience who had once scoffed at the idea of practical ingenuity. Now some of them had their eyes wet with a kind of recognition. Not everyone would be convinced by words, but for many, the evidence lay before them in usable devices and the lives that those devices had changed. Back in Japan, the company began to publish reports that included qualitative measures as well as traditional quantifiable outcomes. Kenji insisted on supporting long-term apprenticeships and on forming partnerships with universities in the Philippines and other countries. He insisted on sending his senior engineers to rural workshops for 2 weeks at a time, not as a token exercise, but as an immersion. The narrative that had once been uncomplicated, that talent was a simple function of certain institutions, had become more textured. Miguel's life became a rhythm of travel, experiments, teaching, and late-night troubleshooting. He received letters from kids who had fixed something for the first time. He received calls from clinics that had found a cheap way to power a refrigerator for vaccines. He also received critiques and rejections that cut in predictable ways. He had to learn to hold the good in one hand and the necessary corrections in the other. He learned to separate his identity from his projects so that a failed prototype did not feel like a personal collapse. When he returned to his old neighborhood sometimes, people would come to see him with devices that needed a touch. He would sit on the floor and work while neighbors watched. Children would reach out to touch the tools, curious and gentle. At night, he would lie in his modest guest room and think about the future. Apprentices he wanted to teach, devices he wanted to improve, a small lab in his neighborhood where young people could learn without leaving home. He had a dream that value could be created at the margins, where access was thin but curiosity thick. Genji occasionally reflected on his own transformation, the way a man looks at a hand that has changed shape with labor. He thought of the initial gaze he had cast on Miguel, a glance that measured and misread. He thought about the long months of projects, of the stubbornness of failure and the quiet work that followed. He did not make a spectacle of his change. He considered it an internal reorientation, like retuning a compass. It affected his decisions. He asked different questions in meetings. He asked how designs would be used in less than ideal conditions. Those questions were small but durable. The work they had done did not erase inequality. It did not rearrange the global order overnight. But it did show that a particular kind of blindness could be corrected if people paid attention. Miguel's small victories multiplied into examples that other companies began to examine. The idea that resources and opportunity could meet talent in unusual places spread. A young woman who had learned to solder in a barangay workshop recently received a job offer from a social enterprise funded by one of Takahashi's new programs. A startup incubator offered micro-grants to projects that used local materials. Those were the kinds of changes that do not look glorious in headlines, but matter in daily life. Years after the initial competition, Miguel stood in a small hall in his hometown and spoke to a group of teenagers. He told them what he had told many before, that good engineering was not only problem-solving, but a kind of listening. He wanted them to feel seen and to feel useful. He wanted them to feel that their hands could translate wonder into work that helped someone else. One day, he told them, someone might tell you that where you come from is a weakness. They might say it softly, thinking they are being realistic. Don't let their words be your limit. Take what you have where you are and make something. Fix it for the person next to you. If you change one life, you change the pattern. He had not become famous for its own sake. He had become useful, and that usefulness opened more doors for people behind him. Kenji had not become a different man overnight. He had changed in small, stubborn increments. He had listened. He had given resources. He had admitted error. The friction of those changes created heat, new programs, a different kind of recruitment, and a company conversation that included people from workshops and villages alongside academics and corporate managers. In private moments, Miguel would sometimes fish the small wrench from his pocket and run a thumb over its worn teeth. He would remember the rain in Tokyo that had been the backdrop for his first surprise, but also remember the smell of a neighborhood kitchen, the slow spin of a fan in need of repair, and the face of a mother who had cheered quietly when her son did something risky. He carried both places in his hands. They were not separate chapters. They were braided. The story did not end with a single accolade. It continued as movement and as labor. New technicians learned how to extend the life of things. New students found ways to use cheap materials to solve problems that had previously been left to expensive solutions. An elder in a coastal town could decant fuel less wastefully. A clinic could keep vaccines cold a little longer. Those were modest differences. They were differences that mattered. If you looked at the arc of it, you could say that one man's willingness to be wrong and one young engineer's refusal to be defined by origin changed a field's modest practices. You could say that a single competition had a ripple effect because people in positions of power chose to act differently afterward. What mattered most to those who did the labor was not the global applause or the edits to company policy. It was the small, immediate improvements in people's lives. For Miguel, the work remained close to the ground. For Kenji, the work became more complicated in the right ways. How to use corporate muscle to support small, effective tools without turning the projects into something that lost the very thing that made them useful. Years later, when people told the story of the Filipino engineer who had changed a CEO's mind, the telling usually stuck to two names, Miguel Santos and Kenji Takahashi. That was not inaccurate, but those who had lived through the work knew the truth was bigger. It was about a community that had always made something out of scarcity and about a leader who had learned, through observation, failure, and human contact, to recognize a different kind of talent. It was about how usefulness and humility, when combined, could make an architecture of small, resilient change. On a quiet evening, Miguel stood on the roof of the modest building that now housed a workshop he had helped fund. He looked toward the sea where small lights dotted the horizon. The ocean smelled like salt and labor. Children's laughter leaked from a nearby room where a class tinkered with a donated kit. He felt the wrench in his pocket like an old talisman. He thought about the woman who had taught him the days of the week in Tagalog with songs, and the man who had taught him how to hold a tool until it yielded. He thought about the CEO who had once measured him on a list and then, later, had stood humbled. The world had not become simple. It remained messy and needy and full of work. He tightened the wrench on a loose hinge and smiled at nothing and everything that had brought him here.